think that when you have a lectureship centered upon the Bible that you cannot get people to attend and that you just cannot have a lectureship like that. But there have been many fine brethren that have shown that you can have a lectureship centered upon the Bible and the teaching of the Bible, and they've had these lectureships for many years and at various parts of the country. There is one of the old preacher stories that's made its rounds about a lady that was getting ready to pull into a parking slot in a parking lot, and a young man in a red sports car whipped right in front of her and took her parking space. She rolled down her window and she said, when he got out of his car, "Young man, you can't do that. You got my parking space." He looked at her and he said, "When you're young and fast, said you can get those parking places like that." She backed up, put her car in gear, and with her big Lincoln Continental smashed that little red sports car. He said, "Lady, you cannot do that." She rolled down her window again and says, "When you're old and rich, you can do that." So sometimes brethren think that if you are biblically centered and you stay on the Bible, that you cannot have a lectureship and it cannot be sustained. Well, you can. If you have Christian people, you can. They can have such a lectureship. At this early hour, it may be a temptation to relapse back into a little nap, so if that happens to you, well, feel free to do so. One guy that went to church a lot went to see his doctor, and the doc said, "What's wrong with you?" The fellow said, "Doc, I just snore, something terrible." He said, it's just real loud." The doc said, "I imagine that keeps your wife awake a lot, doesn't it?" He said, "My wife, nothing." Said, "It disturbs the whole church when I snore." So he wanted some relief. But the subject that is assigned to me has to do with the power of the printed page. Through the years, our brethren have proclaimed the gospel orally. They've been preaching the gospel. And through the years, our brethren have had periodicals and publications, have written tracts and booklets to try to continue to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. In our day and time, printing is an important means of conveying information and knowledge. When you look at all of the things that are printed and circulated in this day and time, it's obvious that a lot of people are using the printed page to further their cause or their position. As you look at the tremendous number of books, over 500 million books printed in the United States, when you look at the various newspapers that are circulated in our cities, over 500 billion newspapers printed in a year's time in our country. When you look at the magazines that are published and circulated, over 25 billion in our country, it's obvious that there are a lot of things that are printed. Printing was something that was invented by the Chinese, but they could not figure out a process to speed things up. But in about 1440, Gutenberg was able to speed things up with a movable type. Nowadays, in modern times, we have offset printing that is extremely fast, and the web presses can turn out a tremendous amount of material in just a short amount of time. But printing is important in that it not only helps us to spread the word, but today you can buy a Bible at a reasonable price. We have printed Bibles all over the country and all over the world, and we should be grateful for the blessings that we have along that line. In earlier years, in the Dark Ages, people wanted to get copies of the Bible. They wanted it so strongly, but they were having a hard time. In the Dark Ages, the Bible was there on the rostrum or the pulpit, and they had it chained to the pulpit so that the members could not take it away. So the members of the church would get there early. And one of the reasons they would get there early would be to slip up there at the rostrum and read the scriptures for themselves. And they would stay late so that they could turn the pages and read the scriptures for themselves, that it chained to the pulpit. What a great blessing we have today. We can own a Bible, and most of us probably have several Bibles. We have Bibles for ourselves, Bible for our children, and Bibles for our grandchildren. And we have the blessing of reading and studying the Bible for ourselves in our own language. That is a tremendous and a great blessing, and we ought to be thankful for the blessings that we have. But isn't it strange how people that in the dark ages struggled so hard to get the Bible so that they could read it for themselves, and they were so intensely interested in reading the Bible, and yet in our day and time we have Bibles everywhere, and the problem is it's hard to get people to knock the dust off of them to really open up the Bible to read the Bible for themselves. Bibles in abundance, Bible on shelves, the Bible in the book rack, Bibles in our homes, and yet so many people just do not read the Bible. We need then to take advantage of what we have and read the Bible for ourselves. In the history of the Restoration movement in the United States, that history is interwoven, especially with periodicals and publications, and how these proclaim positions and what they stood for. Alexander Campbell saw, after some of his early debates, the importance and the significance of printed material. And so as a result, in 1823 to 1830, he published the Christian Baptist. The Christian Baptist was a publication that was intended to destroy ecclesiasticism, to destroy the religious systems of the day and time. Campbell was very combative. And in the Christian Baptist, he set out the fallacies and the errors of the denominational world round about him. And people read it, they were interested in it, and people began to learn many important and significant lessons. After the Christian Baptist, he started the Millennial Harbinger. That went from 1830 to 1870. The Millennial Harbinger was probably one of the most influential publications of its day. When he was unable to do it and he passed from the scene, his son-in-law continued it through that date of those last few years. But Alexander Campbell early on saw the importance and the significance of the printed page and the circulation of publications so that people could read and to study. When you read something, you can analyze it carefully. You can go back and reread it and study it again. Someone has said that reading makes a man full, conversation makes a man ready, but writing makes a man exact. And that's very true when it comes to preachers. As preachers, we read to absorb a lot of information. We have conversations that makes you ready on questions and answers. But when you put down your sermon or your lesson, you put it down in print, then you have to start sharpening it up and getting it exact. You look at it from the standpoint of grammar, from the standpoint of argumentation, from the standpoint of accuracy and correctness. And does it square with what the Bible says? So Campbell could see that, and he had a tremendous influence upon the reading public because of those publications. But there arose other publications, and some of them early on. In Nashville, Tennessee, in 1855, there arose the Gospel Advocate. Actually, the beginners of the Gospel Advocate, men like Talbot Fanning and William Lipscomb, these men started it. These men started a publication to try to present and teach the truth. A few years later, there was another publication started, and that was the Christian Standard. Still another was the Christian Evangelist. If you can remember these for just a moment, the Millennial Harbinger had been widely circulated. Campbell was the editor. He had started and founded Bethany College. So you have preachers preaching. You have Bethany College turning out preachers. You have the Millennial Harbinger spreading the message around to various places. But with the passing of time, things change. Very few things are going to stay the same as we know them in this world, and things were changing, and new papers arose on the scene. There were many papers that came and they went, hundreds of them. Some of them were very good and some of them were not very good. Some of them had short titles and some of them had long titles. For example, up in Ohio, Arthur Critchfield decided to start a publication, and when he was looking for a name, he finally came out with a rather long name. He said it was the Northern Reformer Heretic Detector Evangelical Review. Now, all of that was the name of his publication. First, there was a Northern Reformer. He was in the North, so I guess he thought, it's going to be a Northern Reformer. And he thought that one of the jobs of papers ought to be to detect heretics. So the rest of the name, it was a heretic detector. And then it was Evangelical Review, evangelistic and reviewing. So he had all of those ideas. That was the title of it. Can you imagine a masthead with a title like that on it for the name of the publication? Well, that was a paper that went for about 5 years or so. But some of these names were quite long. Most of them usually were short. But coming down to the day of the mid-1800s to the later 1800s, there was the Gospel Advocate in Nashville, Tennessee. That was first edited by Fanning and William Lipscomb, but after the Civil War went 1861 to 65 in that bracket. After the Civil War, David Lipscomb came connected with the Gospel Advocate. And Talbot Fanning kind of eased in the background, and really from then on, David Lipscomb was the dominant force in the Gospel Advocate publication in Nashville, Tennessee. Well, the Gospel Advocate, edited by David Lipscomb at that time, was against the rise of missionary societies and against mechanical instruments of music. During the Civil War, no one had had any money much, and there'd been a war going on, and so a lot of these issues were somewhat put on hold. But after the Civil War, these issues began to crank up. There was the Christian Standard. The Christian Standard took the more liberal position, and there was also the Christian Evangelist. They also took a more liberal position. The Christian Evangelist, edited by J.H. Garrison, not only took the liberal position on instrumental music and the missionary society, but they also took the idea and embraced, with the passing of time, many of the modernistic tendencies and thoughts of the day and time. So that was somewhat of the arena. The preachers would write for the publications, they would hold debates, they would write more articles, and so the discussion and the battles were on. Actually, in the North, where the Christian Evangelist went, where the Christian Standard went, those churches, they went digressive. They accepted the missionary society. They accepted mechanical instruments of music. The churches in the South that read and followed mostly the ideas set out in the Gospel Advocate, they were opposed to the American Missionary Society, and they were opposed to mechanical instruments of music. And so in the North, for the most part, it went digressive. And in the South, for the most part, it remained loyal to the principles of the Bible. And there arose two separate groups, those that sought a new order of things and those who wanted to hold to the ancient order of things. And these two groups were along somewhat the same lines. There were a few who tried to straddle the fence. There was the publication, the Apostolic Times. It had several of the well-known brethren of the Brotherhood who served as editors and on the staff. They were opposed to instrumental music, but they were in favor of allowing the missionary society to continue. It was impossible really to straddle the fence like that, and so the Apostolic Times would pass from the scene. And that position that was popular right after the Civil War, by the turn of the century, was a position that people just would not buy. You either had to get on the fence or get off the fence. You had to decide one way or the other which way you were going. And so any preacher or publication that tries really to straddle the fence and tries to please one side and then tries to please the other side, that will not last too long. Eventually, sooner or later, the person will have to decide which side of the fence that he's going to be on. In the battle that raged over the question of mechanical instruments of music, for example, when that issue first started, people were not using mechanical instruments of music. One of the first places, in fact, the first one we have a record of, was in Midway, Kentucky. There were people talking about, say there's a church that's using mechanical instruments of music. So there was a man that was publishing a paper called the American Christian Review. The editor's name was Ben Franklin. So he wrote an article against mechanical instruments of music. This is one of the early articles against it. And the way he opposed it was with a bit of satire. He asked the question, well, what church would use mechanical instruments of music? Well, one where a church never had or has lost the Spirit of Christ, they would use mechanical instruments of music. Two, if a church has a preacher who never had or has lost the Spirit of Christ, who has become dry, prosing, and lifeless as a speaker, so as to be entirely incapable of commanding and interesting an audience, it is thought that instrumental music would draw out and interest the people. That's the second place where you'd find mechanical instruments of music. Third, if a church only intends being fashionable society, a mere place of amusement and secular entertainment, and abandoning all idea of religion and worship, instrumental music would be a very pleasant and agreeable part of such entertainment. Number four, if a church has in it a large number of dishonorable and corrupt men who follow cheating and swindling of one sort or the other, then that is the church where they would have mechanical instruments of music. I like that one. That one really caught my attention. Number five, if a church has given up all ideas of trying to convert the world or ever to convert anybody, then that's the church that would have mechanical instruments of music. And it was Ben Franklin in the American Christian Review who raised this important argument. When it comes to instrumental music, he said, Christ did not command it. The apostles did not authorize it. No New Testament writer sanctioned it, and no New Testament church ever practiced it. That's a strong argument against mechanical instruments of music. Well, that article was so strong that the guy using the mechanical instruments of music couldn't stand it. He had to say something in defense of his mechanical instruments of music. You know, it's like we say down in Tennessee on the farm, when the dogs get out, you know, in the smokehouse and rambling around into things in the night, and you get out and you can't see, you know they're there, you take a stone up and throw it out through there, and if you hit one, guess what? Boy, he's going to yelp. Well, that's exactly what happened. When Ben Franklin threw that stone, that lesson out there, well, the guy was hit, so he's going to yelp. He's going to say something. It's kind of like a lot of people today. If the publications get on a movement or get on some guy that's off track, they always want to criticize the publication. Oh, they're just riding a hobby. Or they're just giving this guy a hard time. Or they misunderstood what he said. Or he was misquoted. Or he's really a nice fella after all. And why are they picking on him? Well, you hear that even today. Well, the man that started this business was a man by the name of L.L. Pinkerton. And he sent in a reply. This came out in the American Christian Review, Volume 3, Number 9, February 28, 1860, on page 19. I went through a considerable deal of effort to locate this and to get a copy of it. Then after I got the copy of it, it's so hard to read that I had to start analyzing it to get it so that it was readable. And finally I got it out, and it was printed in its entirety. We won't read the entirety of it here, except to say that when you look at what Ben Franklin wrote, he said, do not anticipate a reply to your article. It defies reply. He's sending a reply, but said, do not expect a reply. It defies reply. That's the inconsistency of people. People say, you shouldn't be antagonistic against that position or that doctrine. And yet they're antagonistic, saying you cannot be antagonistic. They are inconsistent. This fellow was inconsistent. He said, don't expect a reply. It defies reply. And then he talks about the keepers of orthodoxy. This is L.L. Pinkerton. I know it may be impolitic in me to avow an opinion not sanctioned by popular editors. I have found the caliber of our more noted champions, those who are par excellent keepers of the faith, and I wish them to know that I entertain very little respect for their dogmatism. What does he do? He casts reflection on what he calls the keepers of the faith. That sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Just like people today. Then he said, our congregational singing had degenerated into a discordant bawling and screeching that might well serve to rid any church not of worshipers only, but even of rats meeting on Saturday evenings. He said, the reason we did it, our singing had such squealing and bawling in it that it would not only get rid of members, but it'd run the rats off. It'd been better if they'd run the rats off. And so he said, we had our meeting on Saturday evenings. We proposed for the purpose of improvement in singing. A melodeon was introduced as a means of finding the keynotes of tunes, and it was played as an accompaniment by some of our sisters. So the women got into the act. Could I be certain of those ladies? Then he says, I have thought this historic sketch due to the church at Midway. Now, that's the reply that was made when mechanical instruments of music were introduced in 1860 in Midway, Kentucky. Now, I just want you to think about this a minute. Here was a church. Other brethren were not using mechanical instruments of music. Here was a church. They decided to have it. Look at the church. It was made up of people who wanted something like that. They were a worldly bunch. Look at their preacher, Dr. L.L. Pinkerton. He's a doctor. Friends, if you get a doctor preacher and a worldly church together, you can do some real unusual and strange things. Not only that, they had some women that were pushing this. So if you get a worldly church and you get some women that are wanting something done the way they want it done, and you've got a doctor preacher, and you put that combination together, brother, you have got some more combination. And what he does is simply to give a sketch of what they did. He doesn't try to defend it from the Scriptures. He doesn't try to give any rebuttal by argument from the Scriptures. None at all. In fact, when you read through this whole thing, there is not a reference to the Bible, the Scriptures, in any part of it. All he says is, we wanted it, we tried it, we liked it, and we're going to keep it. Now that's the procedure that was followed in Midway, Kentucky when it was put in. And this is all a matter of historical record. Brethren who have read these things have known that for years. The papers, the Christian Evangelist and the Christian Standard, they tried to pick up the idea and tried then to get some arguments to try to justify it. And these have been hashed and rehashed in the papers through the years. But a lot of our brethren, see, have not read that, and they have not studied history, so they have no idea, many of them, what happened 100 years ago. And there are people right now knocking on the door in many congregations wanting to put the mechanical instrument of music right in. They're knocking right at the doors. And there are some of our preachers who serve not only as preachers for our congregations, but they also serve as adjunct professors for the Christian church colleges. And so they're trying to play both fields. They're teachers for the Christian church, and they're also preachers in our pulpits. And they use these men all over the country and use them as speakers on meetings and lectureships and things like that. Brethren just have not studied and analyzed history, nor have they studied the Bible for themselves. Notice how the arguments have changed. Early on, some of the arguments were used was that it was in the Old Testament, so therefore it must be all right. J.W. McGarvey answered that particular argument. He pointed out that the Old Testament is abolished. We're not under the Old Testament. We're under the New Covenant or the New Testament. Then some of them argued, the word singing, that would allow playing or singing or a combination of playing or singing. No, the word singing is a specific word. M.C. Carfees pointed that out. Just like gopher wood is a particular type of wood, singing is a particular kind of music. If the Bible said just make music, you could have any kinds you wanted, vocal, mechanical, or a combination of the other two. That's one of the problems with the NIV, the New International Version. It says make music. That's incorrect. If it were correct, then friend, you could have any kind of music you wanted. You could have vocal, mechanical, or a combination of the two. The word singing is a specific term that indicates exactly what is to be done. If we had someone over here and we say sing, he would sing. If we had someone else over here and we said play, then he would know that he was to play. Well, there's a difference in singing and playing, and it's just that simple as the difference in the New Testament worship to God. Well, then they looked at the word baptize. This word baptize is a specific kind of action. It is immersion. It rules out sprinkling, and it rules out pouring. It's just as specific as the word singing. Sometimes people say, well, singing doesn't rule out mechanical instruments of music. It does. The word baptism rules out sprinkling and pouring. The word for sprinkling, the Greek word is rantizo. That's not used. Well, what are we to do in this action? We are to baptize. The Greek word baptizo means to immerse. That rules out everything else. Well, the fellows were losing on that, and then men came along, like Payne and others, who said, well, the Greek word, silo, that includes mechanical instruments of music. And we went through a little phase in the publications. Everybody was writing about silo, article after article, booklet after booklet, on the word silo. A lot of people said that's just a Greek word. They're arguing about a Greek word. A lot of people didn't understand all the argument about the Greek word. But finally, it came down to where people could see it. Like in the Hardeman-Boswell debate. N.B. Hardeman debated Boswell. They were supposed to have had that debate all over the country. But when they had one debate in Nashville, Tennessee, that ended that. No more debates. That was the end of it. Hardeman pointed out that the Lord has authorized exactly the instrument that is to be used, namely the heart. Ephesians 5:19, speaking to yourselves in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. So the instrument is the heart of man, and it rules out all the other. Besides that, if mechanical instruments of music inhered in the Greek word silo, then when we are told to silo, everyone would be required to play on a mechanical instrument of music. That proved too much for the opposition. They did not want to affirm that everyone must play some kind of instrument. They did not want to affirm that. But if the word silo includes mechanical instruments of music, then it would not only authorize it, but it would require that everyone play on a mechanical instrument of music. So they decided that argument was no good. They gave it up. Now, the current argument that is used by the Christian church, and this is found in the publication One Body, and also in the Christian Standard, still these same articles. The new current position of the Christian church on instrumental music is that God does not require any kind of music for the congregation. You just kindly do what you want to. They say not only is mechanical instruments of music not commanded, but now they affirm even congregational singing is not authorized or not commanded. Now they've reached this point over the years and years of controversy and discussion. And whenever they have discussions, that's what they say. Whenever they write articles, that's exactly what they say. But in Colossians 3:16 and 17, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. You men, it is plural, refers, as Thayer says, to the congregation, to the assembly And besides that, the terms that are used are reciprocal terms, teaching and admonishing one another, speaking one to the other in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. How would you be teaching and admonishing one another in songs if there's nobody else there? You couldn't do it. It'd be impossible for you to do that. There's got to be somebody else there for you to be able to teach and admonish one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. So once you get two, you've got an assembly. The Lord said, where two or three are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them. But this discussion on instrumental music and the Missionary Society went on for years. By the turn of the century, by the 1900s to 1925, there was a tremendous change that took place. The change that took place was in basic fundamentals: evolution, destructive higher criticism. All of these came into play, and most of the colleges and the universities of the country were swept away into modernism and liberalism. People that did not believe the inspiration of the Bible, they did not believe the deity of Christ, they did not believe in the virgin birth, they did not believe in the plan of salvation. There were some in the restoration ranks. For example, R.C. Cave preached a sermon, and the text of it came out in the newspaper in St. Louis. His idea was that the miracles did not really happen. He denied the virgin birth. He denied the plan of salvation. He said there was no plan. He was in the same vein of L.L. Pinkerton. A fact that a lot of people do not know is that L.L. Pinkerton was not only for mechanical instruments of music, he was one of the emerging liberals. He denied verbal inspiration of the Bible. Not only that, he believed that when you consider people who are members of the church, that the pious, unimmersed, ought to be considered children of God. Now, if you're wondering about that phrase, the pious, unimmersed, that means if there's a good old fella, you know, here's old Joe, he comes to church every once in a while, he's not obeyed the gospel, he's not a Christian. Well, what happens when old Joe dies? Why, he's all right on that view. They believe that the pious, the good people, even though they'd not been baptized, they're all right. Well, that's modernism. It all goes together. That's liberalism. Today on the scene, there are many publications. These are circulated. A lot of people are spending time with television and VCR rather than reading either the Bible or religious publications. A lot of people are not reading. Probably less than 10% of our people read anything, no matter what. When you are in the publishing business, you look at a congregation or church, whatever the number is, on the average you can say there's less than 10% that read anything. People just do not read. There are a lot of people who are functionally illiterate in the United States. That is, they cannot read above the 8th grade, 4th grade, 5th grade level. They may be on a job somewhere, and they are not able to read the instructions about what they're supposed to do. Someone has to tell them. They do not read. And any time you have a large segment of people who do not read and do not keep up with what is happening and what is going on, then you're headed for a lot of trouble. That's true in the churches. One of the reasons, really, that churches today are having so many problems with the invasion of the cultism, of crossroadism, and the Boston movement. So many problems over marriage, divorce, and remarriage. People just will not take what Matthew 19:9 says. When it comes to the plan of salvation, it's set out in the book of Acts very clearly. The reason that there is so much confusion is because of the ignorance of so many of the masses of the people. It's not because the publications are printing arguments that people cannot understand or cannot read. What it is people are not willing to take the time to learn for themselves. We need to read Hosea 4:6, my people perish for lack of knowledge.